Welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed making that hovercraft. Maybe you can save it for later if you didn't quite get round to it. You could have a race and see whose hovercraft can get the furthest. Now, so far we've looked at how God creates water. And in this part, we're going to look at how God moves the water. Now, many, many years have passed since God created the world. And God's people are now living in Egypt. And this story is about possibly one of the most important people in the Old Testament, a man called Moses. He hasn't had an easy life so far. The Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, tried to kill all of the baby boys when he was little. And he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. And he went to live in the palace. God has a plan for Moses. One day he's out tending the sheep and he hears God's voice telling him to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let the people go. Pharaoh's not very keen, and so he decides, no, I'm not going to let my slaves, I'm not going to let the people go. And then God sends 10 plagues, 10 things that went wrong in Egypt, each one worse than the one before. And so eventually, Pharaoh has had enough and says, get out, go. This is what happens when they left. That very night, Moses and God's people fled out of Egypt and out of slavery. They were free at last. God's people would always remember this rescue and call it Passover. But an even greater rescue was coming. God makes a way. Moses and God's people escaped out of Egypt into the wilderness. They didn't know the way, but God knew the way and would show them. I'll bring you to a new home, a special land, God promised them. I will look after you. I am with you. God sent a big cloud for them to follow, a pillar of smoke stretching up to the sky. It moved in front of them as they walked and shaded them from the blazing heat of the day. And when it was time to rest, it stopped. All through the cold desert nights, it kept them warm, glowing like fire. God led his people through the desert to the edge of the great sea. They were just wondering how to cross it when suddenly there was a terrible thundering and pounding. It sounded almost like horses' hooves. They shaded their eyes to look back and screamed. It was! Pharaoh and his army were coming to get them. Pharaoh had changed his mind again. Get my slaves back, he screeched, and charged out into the desert after them with 600 of his fastest horsemen and every single chariot in Egypt. What were God's people going to do? In front of them was the big sea, and it was so big that there was no way around it. There was no way through it. It was too deep. They didn't have any boats, so they couldn't sail across, and they couldn't swim across because it was too far and they would drown. And they couldn't turn back because Pharaoh was chasing them. They could see the flashing swords now, glinting in the baking sun, and the dust clouds, and the chariot after scary chariot surging towards them. So they did the only thing that there was to do: panic. We're going to die, they shrieked. Don't be afraid, Moses said. But there's nothing we can do, they screamed. God knows there's nothing you can do, Moses said. God will do it for you. Trust him and watch. But there's no way out, they cried. God will make a way, Moses said. Another minute and it would have been over. But then the strangest thing happened. God made a pillar of God made the pillar of smoke move. It moved behind his people and hid them from the Egyptians. Then God sent a strong east wind to blow all night long. It blew on the water of the big sea. It blew it to the left and it blew it to the right until it blew into two towering walls of water. And there, right in the middle of the sea, a muddy pathway opened up. And God's people walked across on dry land. Amazing. When the Egyptians tried to follow, the walls of water crashed back down on them and swallowed them up. God's people were safe. They danced and they laughed and they sang and they thanked God. When there would be no way out, God had made a way. Many years later, once again, God was going to make a way where there was no way. From the beginning, God's children had all been running from him and hiding. God knew his children could never be happy without him, but they couldn't get back to him by themselves. They were lost. They didn't know the way back, but God knew the way, and one day he would show them. Maybe later on we'll find out what that way is. Moses was an ordinary man, and God helped him to do an extraordinary thing. With God's help, he moved the whole sea so that the Israelites could escape on dry land. They escaped from the Pharaoh and his army. How would you feel if you were walking along the sea bed? How would you feel seeing the walls of water either side? I think it would help us to think a bit more about how powerful God is. Not only did he create the water, but he also moved the water. And that's not the only time he's done that. Here's a little science experiment for us to do. Here's an experiment that you can try at home. All you'll need is a bowl. I've got this mixing bowl that I've put a little bit of water in. You don't need too much. And then you need some pepper and some washing up liquid. And I've put it in this jar or bowl because it's easier. And what we're going to do is sprinkle a thin layer of the pepper on the surface of the water. Not too much. And then I'm going to take my finger and I'm going to dip it in the dishwasher soap. Okay. And when I put my finger in the water, let's see what happens. All of the pepper moved. I wonder if that's what it looked like when God moved the water. Have a go at home and experiment with a few things. Maybe you could try it with antibacterial hand gel or hand wash. See if those things make a difference and can make this